I'm Meggie Fredman, and I'm American Jewish Committee's Deputy Director of Young Leadership. This year, we witnessed the resilience of college students across the country in the face of a global pandemic. For Jewish students, campuses continue to foster positive experiences, community building, and meaningful learning. Yet today's Jewish college students are faced with growing challenges, including mounting efforts to boycott or delegitimize Israel, a rising number of anti-Semitic incidents reported on campus, and an increase in anti-Jewish discrimination directed towards student leaders. And AJC works to support our students at each step. To give us a view from campus and help us understand today's challenges and opportunities, we are joined by two talented young leaders who took up the mantle of leadership on their own campuses. Julia Jassey is a current student at the University of Chicago and a co-founder of Jewish on Campus. Talia Rosenberg is a recent graduate of the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you both for being with us.
Thank you for having us. It's an honor.
Yes, thank you.
I'm so glad to have you both, and let's get right into the view from campus. So each of you come from different campus environments and certainly are at different stages in your academic careers. But what you both share is your choice to create change. And that is a bold choice and one that deserves an enormous amount of credit. How did you decide to get involved with Jewish activism and Israel advocacy on campus? And Talia, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. Well, really, I came from a very strong Jewish family. Both sides of my family have always felt very passionately about our Judaism and about our connection to Israel. And additionally, I went to Jewish day school for many years. So it was something I grew up with, something that was a constant in my life that was unquestionable, my support for Israel. But when I reached high school at a different school that was not a day school, I faced a lot of anti-Israel activism from close friends that I had done work with on other political things before, and I felt a lot of confusion. I didn't know how to answer their questions. I didn't know the entire history dating back before 47 or from 47 to 67 or 67 to 2017. So there was a lot going on that I didn't know how to respond to. And because of that, I felt that I really needed to dig in and get the information so that I could be a proper advocate for Israel. And so by the time I got to college, that was one of my biggest goals, to learn how to be a good advocate for the state of Israel and for the Jewish people. So that's why one of the first clubs that I joined at Penn was the Penn Israel Public Affairs Committee. And additionally, another club I joined later was Resetting the Table, which led dialogue within a range of the Jewish community, politically and religiously, about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And those are clubs that I have given a lot of my time to, and I think have really helped me to be a fierce advocate for Israel and for the Jewish people at large.
Mm-hmm. Julia, can you give us a sense of what your experience and what led you to take action?
Yeah, first of all, thank you again for having me. It's truly an honor to be here. I had a little bit of a different experience. I come from Long Island, New York, which is a place where I always joke around that there are lots of Jews here, but saying that you're Jewish is like saying you play soccer. It's just a piece of you that no one really pays much mind to. But I come from a family where Israel was very integral to our existence. On my dad's side, I'm a child of a family who lost half a generation to the Holocaust. On my mom's side, I'm a child of a family of Jewish refugees to Israel who escaped ethnic cleansing in Iraq, Yemen, and Spain. So I come from a family who needed Israel to survive. So this has always been a very personal situation for me. And I remember, I never really had to confront it in high school, and I came to college my first year. And my first real experience was I was in the busiest class building on campus, and there was a table outside canvassing, and I didn't know what it was for. There were people all around, and I saw a poster that said Israel, so I walked over to the table. I thought it would be, an Israel event. So I asked the guy at the table, what is this for? And I remember he said, it's against the occupation. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, the occupation, Israeli occupying Palestine. And I remember in that moment feeling really helpless. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to respond. So I turned around and I walked away. said, I'm not interested. And I remember feeling red, and I remember feeling embarrassed that I didn't know how to defend something that was so important to my family, something that was so important to myself. And I felt really ashamed of that. So I decided that I needed to learn how to defend it. So I started reading books, and I started watching lectures, and I started reading articles. And that's when I got to meet other students from schools around the country, and even around the world, who were having similar experiences to me. You know, it's painted as a political issue, but Israel is more than that. It's the Jew among states. It's a scapegoat the same way that Jews are scapegoats. And when Zionism is being used as a way to mask anti-Semitism, I don't hate the Jews, I just hate the Zionists. It affects all of us. I mean, we're all experiencing this individually. And we decided
Julia, I actually want to pick up exactly on that point. So
yeah.
Thank you for raising it. From your perspective, on campus today, I mean, hearing about what led you to understand what happened on campus, is, I think, an experience that many of our students share. Now that you're there and you have made that jump, and I think this is what you're getting to, can you share with us, what do you think is the most persistent challenge in fighting anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment on campus? And Julia, why don't you pick up there, and we'll start with you, and then Talia, we'll turn to you.
Yeah, what makes anti-Semitism this enduring hatred, the world's oldest hatred, is that it constantly changes form. It's rooted in the idea of the Jew is the ultimate scapegoat. It's a really brilliant concept. You know, you have a problem in the world, you want someone to blame. You don't want to internalize that, just blame the Jews. And it changes its form every generation. So this new pernicious form of anti-Semitism we're seeing, anti-Zionism, saying that Israel has no right to exist. I've seen people say that, you know, recently with the recent clash between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, people saying that there's no such thing as an Israeli citizen, that all Israelis are born inherently guilty. You see this recycled blood libel that we've been seeing since back in, you know, Middle Ages Europe that is resurfacing with a new face. Instead of hating the Jew, you hate the Zionist. And I think that's really dangerous because people who aren't Jewish, people who haven't experienced it, won't know how to recognize it. So I think the biggest threat is if we're not able to educate those around us on what anti-Semitism looks like because it's constantly changing face, we won't be able to combat it as well. So the first step is to clearly outline what is and what isn't anti-Semitic, so nothing is lost in translation.
I think that is very much something that is pressing on campus. And like you said, I think that identification is so critical. Talia, I want to turn to you to get your perspective as well. What do you think is one or two of the most persistent challenges in fighting anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment today on campus?
Thank you. Well, I would definitely agree with Julia that I think the biggest problem around the world with fighting anti-Semitism is a lack of education and understanding. But for me personally on my campus, I have seen the biggest challenge to fighting both anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is just apathy. And I think that at a place like Penn, where there's a lot to focus on, you know, pre-professionalism, your classes, and a million and 10 things that people are prioritizing, somehow fighting for your people and fighting for certain political movements just gets pushed to the bottom. And I think that that can be a very big problem when we see, you know, what we saw last month with Israel and Gaza, when students who haven't been trained to advocate are now pushed out into the real world beyond campus and are seeing this anti-Israel and anti-Semitic activism, and they don't know how to respond. So I think that while a huge problem on most college campuses is facing this anti-Semitism and this anti-Israel sentiment on campus, and I would never want to go through that, a huge problem can also just be this apathy and then not being prepared when the moment comes to truly defend yourself and your people. So I think while educating is really important, I also think it's important to remind people where they come from, what they stand for, and to remember to continue to stand for that out in the real world.
That actually is a perfect segue to turning to the recent violence in Israel, which you both touched on. We have seen several student governments in academic departments draft and circulate statements of solidarity with Palestinians, many of which actually include very egregious accusations of ethnic cleansing, of genocide committed by Israel, and have a glaring omission of the thousands of rockets that Hamas has had fired against Israeli civilians. How are students responding from your perspectives when their own academic departments and student representatives who are meant to represent them and speak for them are disseminating these one-sided extremist rhetorics? And what advice do you have for students who are faced with these types of biased resolutions? Julia, let us know from your perspective. We'll turn to you first.
Yeah, I think right now students don't know how to respond. I think as a community, we've known there's been this buzzword, campus antisemitism. We've known it's a problem and we've kind of acknowledged it, but not done much to really confront it. And I think that we're seeing what the result of that is now. I've definitely seen a tremendous amount of it on my campus, and through Jewish on Campus, I've heard about it from other schools as well. And I think there's a really big difference between advocating for Palestinians and advocating against Israelis. And that's a lot of what we're seeing. We're seeing Zionists, we're seeing Israelis, we're seeing Israel being demonized, to the point where, in my own personal experience, I shared a story about, I have family in Tel Aviv. There was a tremendous amount of rocket fire targeting civilians in Tel Aviv. And I shared a story about it on my Instagram, and somebody responded to tell me that I was being tone deaf for even acknowledging my own family suffering. There's, I think, a scary amount of dehumanization of Israelis, which is, the first step toward a dangerous rise in anti-Semitism. And so how do we confront that? I think the first thing that is dangerous is if we think that being quiet is the right thing to do. And I understand, and I've been in the position where everyone around you is kind of engaging in rhetoric that is oftentimes libelous. We've crossed the point of criticism of Israel here. We're getting into blood libel territory. America's existed for over 200 years, has a really dangerous history of racism. And I've seen resolutions calling, Israel the root of that, the state that's existed for 70 years, as the root of police brutality and racism in the U.S. There are resolutions that have happened at Tufts University, kind of called Deadly Exchange, which claim that, which is that's libelous because it's very clear to track the history of American racism, and that's kind of just one example. I think when issues like
I actually, sorry, I want to follow up just on one thing you said.
Yeah.
For students who are being faced with this idea that certain ideals that we might care about, things like racism, right? That which are critical, which we all should be calling out. When those things are being bundled with having an anti-Israel stance, how can students separate those and say that one actually is not, this notion that both are bundled is just totally off base? How do you address that?
Well, I think the first thing to realize is that you're not the only one who thinks that way, that there's so much of not only the Jewish community, but the larger community that agrees with you. But we're scared to talk about it because everyone else is saying things to the contrary. And we do face backlash when we do speak up. But the more of us that do speak up, the less this idea will be normalized. The more of us that do speak up, we can actually confront the real history and the true problems that America faces with racism that must be addressed in an honest and effective way. So I think that if we are vocal about the social issues in the United States that we care about, we continue to be vocal about those because they are important to us, and we're vocal about Israel, and we're vocal about anti-Semitism, we tell others that it's okay for them to be vocal about both of these issues as well. And that's a really important thing to spread.
Thank you for that. I want to turn to something actually that came up in both of your answers earlier. The role that social media has played in the recent escalation in Israel. So increasingly, social media provides an enormous platform for students. It allows for your perspectives to span far beyond your immediate campus, really to have a global impact. And with the recent escalation of Hamas-induced violence in Israel, We've seen rampant misinformation, anti-Semitism, and anti-Israel rhetoric spreading across social media to a degree that we had not previously encountered. What role can students play in weighing in on these events? And what do you say to students who feel overwhelmed and disappointed by the content they're seeing on their feeds and may actually be afraid to jump into the fray? Talia, let's start with you.
Thank you. Well, I would say one thing that some people might find controversial, and I think that it is that Jewish students, first and foremost, need to look out for their own mental health. So I think that if you're seeing a lot of content online that is giving you, severe anxiety, making you very upset, I think it is okay to take a step back and take a break for a few days. I think it is so, so important to stand up for what you believe in. But I also think, this is happening to you. It is happening to your people. And so it is your prerogative to decide when to take a break and when to step up. As for when to step up, I think that social media has never and will never be the forum to have this conversation. I think that it really is an information contest. So it is so important to help disseminate that correct information about Israel and to continue to put out informative resources. But I also think a great tactic is if you see a close friend sharing something and the first thought in your mind is, how could they possibly believe this? Maybe you text them on the side and you say, hey, let's have a conversation about this. Because the truth is, speaking to someone and having a real dialogue is always going to work better than commenting on their infographic. So I think while social media can be a really powerful tool, and we also need to learn how to utilize it, and I know Julia knows how to utilize it very well, and it's something that I'm always very proud of to see what Jewish on Campus posts. I think it's also important to recognize, how can I really get to someone? And I think that people don't expect that when they put something on their story or on their feed, that you're going to then go to them personally and say, let's have a talk about this. Because the truth is, that friend that's posting, Zionism is racism, or there should be more deaths on the Israeli side as there are on the side in Gaza, they're just doing it because it's a trend that they are hopping on because they believe it is the next social justice movement. And when you contact them personally, that's not something they're prepared for. So I think that that's really the best way to handle it, is to have those conversations and be armed with the truth.
Thanks for that. And you alluded to it, but Julia, I think you have a unique perspective here as well as one of the co-founders of Jewish on Campus and someone who themselves is quite vocal on social media. What do you have to say for what's going on, and when is or is not the time to respond?
Yeah, I think there are two ways of being an activist, whatever activist means. I think one way is what I do. It's, I work for currently 4 different Jewish organizations. I'm really vocal on social media. I run Jewish on Campus, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to amplifying the voices of Jewish students talking about anti-Semitism we're experiencing on campus, has a platform of almost 30,000 people, has over 1,200 story submissions. And that's one way to be a Jewish activist. And if you choose to be an activist in that way, I cannot implore you enough to do it with a community, because doing this on your own is nothing that you should ever do. And like Talia had just mentioned, I think it's really important to you to prioritize mental health, because burnout is real, and you can't help your community. You can't be well within yourself, and it's really important to prioritize that. Something that I definitely reckon with a lot. Myself and everyone I know in this space reckons with a lot. But the other way to be a Jewish activist, and the equally as important way, I would venture to say, to be a Jewish activist, if not more important way, is to be a strong and vocal and proud Jewish person, is to wear your Magen David around campus, to wear your kippah, to go to Shabbat dinners, go to Hillel, go to Chabad, to not let the voices of intimidation stop you from doing what you were born to do, which is to be a loud and proud Jew. Because that's what I'm of the belief that you cannot be a Jewish advocate if you don't really love your Judaism as a religion, as a culture, as a history, as a people. So remembering why you're doing this, why you're fighting, because you love where you come from, where your culture is in your heart, that is just as important, if not more important, than any vocal, online activism you can do.
That is a beautiful point for us to end on. I want to close out this conversation on a hopeful note and looking towards the opportunities of being a Jewish student. So I have a question for both of you. We have a number of young people watching who are heading to campus, or leaders for tomorrow, who are high school students who themselves put in the work to build up their Jewish identity, be able to talk about Israel on campus. So as two leaders today, I'm going to ask you to share with us two things. The first is what makes you hopeful about being a Jewish student today? And the second is what is one piece of advice you have for Jewish students who are heading to college this fall? And Julia, why don't we start with you?
Yeah. What makes me hopeful is this continued legacy of advocacy from the Jewish student perspective. I think a lot about the movement for Soviet Jewry, where 10,000 people were mobilized in Washington, D.C. by Jewish students advocating for the safety of the Soviet Jewish community. I think that's the legacy that we're trying to uphold, this legacy of not being quiet in the face of injustice. It's something that I hope to continue to be a part of. And, my advice is it comes from a conversation I had with my rabbi last fall when I was kind of beginning to get involved with advocacy. I went to her, my Hillel rabbi, and I said, I'm really upset. What's happening is hard. And someone made the joke to me recently, actually. It was Jewish Heritage Month just in the past, and a lot of antisemitism was coming. And I was like, come on, guys, stop being anti-Semitic on Jewish Heritage Month. And they said, well, this is our heritage. Anti-Semitism is a part of our history. And my rabbi said to me one time, she said, our history is not just this continued cycle of persecution. It's this continued cycle of resilience. And that's what we uphold. That's what we are. We're people who have survived so much and is still here and will always still be here no matter what we have to face. And that's the legacy that we're a part of. That's the tradition that we're a part of. And it's something I'm so proud to call my history.
That is great. Talia, I'm going to turn to you to close us out.
Well, first, I want to say, Julia, everything you say gives me chills. And that is part of what makes me hopeful is other students like you. And I think just the diversity of ways that one can get involved in the Jewish community on campus, whether that's religiously, politically, culturally, and within those, the 1,010 ways that you can get involved. I think that is what makes me more hopeful, is that for each new day, there's a new way to be proud of your Judaism and a new way to express that. And in terms of a piece of advice, going off of that, I would say, don't be afraid to explore all of your Judaism. I think, some and really all sides of the political spectrum would have you put parts of yourself and your identity in a box and push it to the back of the closet. And I would say that my biggest piece of advice is to explore it all. Explore the particularism of Judaism, explore the universalism of Judaism, explore the secular culture, explore the religious culture, and don't let anyone tell you what parts of your identity are not on trend to be looking at today. So I would say that that's my biggest piece of advice.
Well, I can speak for myself, and I feel confident for all of those who are watching. You too are what make us hopeful about the Jewish future. I want to thank both of our panelists for sharing their experiences with us today. And for the leadership they bring to campus and beyond. Thank you both. To learn more about American Jewish Committee's work on campus and support our work, head to ajc.org/youngleadership. Be sure to stay up to date as to what AJC is doing around the world by following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at AJC Global. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.